Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this afternoon's local plan hearing session. I'm Lynn Donnelly, the Programme Officer. Could I ask that you all turn your cameras on, but keep your microphones muted? The inspectors will join shortly. Thank you. The inspectors have joined the meeting and will now take over. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this hearing session, which will cover HSE matters and also closing remarks. Just before we start, can everybody see and hear me okay? Thank you. So my name is Caroline Malloy, and I've been appointed jointly with David Troy, and we are both planning inspectors and charter town planners. And our remit is to hold the examination to the soundness of this plan and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regards to soundness. With us today is Miss Donnelly, who you should have already met. She works independently of the council, but at our direction, and is responsible for all of the administrative arrangements. So if you have any questions about procedures or practical matters, please contact Lynn. Has everyone seen the latest agenda for today's hearing session? Thank you. Just before we start, just a few sort of housekeeping matters. First of all, to make sure that mobile phones are switched off or switched to silent while the hearing's in session, please. And just a reminder that the hearing sessions are being live streamed and recorded by the council and published shortly after on the examination website for interested parties to view. We just want to say a few words about the submitted plan and our role as inspectors. The starting point for the examination is the submitted plan, which is a delivery and allocations plan, proposed submission draft August 2019. Our role is to assess whether the plan satisfies the requirements of the 2004 Act, the relevant regulations, and whether it is sound, and that is positively prepared, justified, effective, and consistent with national policy. So the session this afternoon will run till 3:30, although there may need to be some flexibility on that. And the hearing session will take the form of a structured discussion based on the agenda, which one of us will lead, following by an agenda based on matters, issues and questions already circulated. We will invite people to speak, but if you do have something to contribute in an appropriate part of the discussion, please indicate your wish to speak by using the raise hand function on Teams. And we ask that you keep your camera switched on for the entire session, but with your microphones muted until you're invited to speak. Does anyone have any questions at this stage in terms of the format of the hearing sessions? Okay, thank you. So just before we start, I'd like to ask participants to introduce themselves, please, starting with the council.
Yes, ma'am. My name's Alistair Cross. I'm a principal planner in the forward planning team, mostly just a watching brief on this afternoon session.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Piers Riley Smith. I'm a barrister at King's Chambers and I'm instructed on behalf of the council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Catherine Brindley. I'm a principal planner on the planning policy team, and as Alistair said, I'll be just having a watching brief this afternoon. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Tim Gibbs. I'm the Director for Planning, Highways and Transport at the Council.
Thank you.
Hello ma'am, Andrew Plant, the Divisional Manager for Planning and Development at the Council, and that's all of the Council's team for this afternoon.
Thank you. And Mr. Tucker, would you like to introduce yourself and say a bit about your role?
Hello, everyone. My name's Harvey Tucker. I'm a Principal Specialist Inspector with the Health and Safety Executive. And I'm part of a unit within HSE, which covers the assessment of major hazards risks.
Thank you. And Mr. Reston?
Yes, I'm Stuart Reston. I'm also a Principal Specialist Inspector for the Health and Safety Executive. I head up HSE's Land Use Planning Advice Team, giving advice to all local authorities in Scotland and Wales on developments near major hazards.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, just before we start the discussion, I would just like to to reiterate really the remit of ourselves as inspectors, which is to consider the soundness of the submitted plan which is before us, and the policies contained within. So just to say up front, really, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that we can't consider the saved policies of previous plans as they're not before the examination. So we are unable to consider, for example, policy CS23, the core strategy, or PR12 of the UDP. So just really to make that clear up front. And also I think it would be very unwise for us to comment on the merits of a particular planning application, either historical or current. And so we won't be drawn on those unless it's a factual matter. However, clearly the local plan does include sites which are proposed to be allocated within HSE consultation zones, and the HSE have made representations on those sites. And the consideration of those sites is a matter which is within the remit of the examination. So I just wanted to set that out, and hopefully that clarifies where we are and the remit of our examination. I believe Mr. Riley-Smith, you wish to make a few comments before we get underway, which may sort of reiterate what I've just said, possibly in a more legalistic way. I don't know.
Well, certainly not in a more legalistic way. I'm very grateful for those opening comments, and Ma'am, as it were, you've stolen my thunder, because those were the 3 points I wished to raise. Really, just to reiterate them, though, and I'll do this in brief because, Ma'am, you've touched on it already. As you say, we're here to examine the soundness of the plan. And again, having read through the HSE's representations, I'm yet to find any reference to the plan being sound and soundness. And that's the task before the examination today. The second point, Ma'am, exactly as you say, is that it's not the remit of today to examine or question policy CS23. And I just think that is worth reiterating because, Ma'am, you were very clear, yourself and Inspector Troy, you were very clear to the HSE about that. But we do still have in their representations certainly a number of paragraphs dedicated to that. And so I thought it important to raise and reiterate that. And finally, Ma'am, what we're not here to do today is to determine any planning applications. The HSE is not a statutory consultee for local plans. They are for planning applications, and that is the appropriate time at which for them to raise concerns in relation to a particular site. Just one point I may return to later on, given some of the case law cited by the HSE, but it is critical to set out at the outset that planning applications are not determined by the views and concerns of the HSE. They are rightly taken into account and considered by Halton as the local planning authority, and then they come to their overall judgment. That is, of course, whether they should grant permission in line with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And of course, part of that development plan will be CS23. So those are all, I appreciate, matters that fall outside of today, but I think very important just to support, Ma'am, what you say and very clearly draw the boundary lines of today's discussion, because in the end, that is what will assist you and Inspector Troy most in the role you have and report you have to write. Unless I can assist any further, Ma'am, those were just some opening comments.
Okay, thank you. I think those points were put probably more eloquently than myself, but thank you for that. So what I would like to do, I mean, obviously we received quite a lot of information yesterday. We've been working through that, but I think it would be a useful starting point if I could ask the council firstly how it has approached the allocation of sites in the local plan, and in particular with regard to managing hazard risk on proposed allocations within consultation zones. I think it might be useful just to set out how the council has approached that process. Is it Mr. Gibbs leading on that today?
It is, Ma'am, thank you. In essence, we have followed the HSE's advice, and their initial comments that were made to the council have been applied to the plan, in the sense that we're very aware of where the sites in the COMA consultation zones themselves lie in the borough. And we've been through the exercise of marrying up the allocations against the boundaries, and some of that's had discussion in previous sessions on the allocations during the examination. So I think in summary, we've taken quite a robust approach in terms of our duties under the Planning Acts in following the guidance with regard to maintaining standoff distances from the relevant establishments. Thanks, Mom.
Okay, thank you. And for example, how has the council sort of approached the consideration of potential allocations within an outer zone, outer consultation zone? Outer consultation zone. Sorry.
Yeah, with regard to the outer consultation zones, we have followed the HSE's land use planning guidance, in that they don't tend to object to much of development in the outer zone of a COMA site. And a lot of the detail I've tried to capture in the council's statement on the HSE's representations, to try and narrow down the sites where there might be a difference of opinion between the council and HSE in terms of whether a site is capable of allocation or not. But within the outer zone, I don't think there is an issue between the council and the HSE in terms of the types of development that are proposed in the plan.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the middle zone, what has the council's approach been there?
Again, it does reflect the HSE's approach with the middle zone. One of the complications with the land allocations is they tend to reflect the site ownership boundaries of the proponents, or the people who are proposing the sites for allocation. And it's often difficult at the early stage to revise those to reflect what an actual development layout might be. So I think previously to the examination, we've submitted a series of plans on the sites and their position with regard to the consultation zones, and in many cases it's fragments of sites that overlap into the consultation zone. So there's very few sites where a whole site will be right in the middle of an inner consultation zone, and the same with regard to the middle zone. So in a lot of cases, when it comes to actual development, a site boundary can be refined to take into account the position of the consultation zones and to actually move development outside of the zone. But as I say, it's quite difficult to do that at a plan allocation stage, because you're very much into the detail and site specifics of designing a development layout. So I think there are a handful of sites within the middle zone, but they tend to accord with the HSE's planning guidance with regard to workspaces and residential development, because the majority are a low number of dwellings. That we've no big strategic sites that fall within any consultation zones.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the inner zone, what has the council's general approach been?
In general, we do avoid the inner zone for development as far as we can, and in effect, I think there's about 4 sites that are in the plan that fall within the inner zone. And my view is that there's other planning merits for those sites that are warranted for consideration at a detailed planning application stage, or at a planning application stage, where the guidance and national policy really comes into play in negotiating and identifying the degree of risk based on the layout that is actually proposed and the number of dwellings within the zone, and then balancing that in the overall planning balance against other benefits and merits of the scheme not related to safety. So, as I say, in terms of the plan overall, I think in the inner zone terms, there's about 4 sites that are between ourselves and the HSE. But I would venture, Marm, that those don't really go to the soundness of the overall plan, in that if the plan was to exclude those, the plan itself would be sound. But equally, I think it would be premature to exclude them at this stage, because I think we should follow the proper process that's set out in planning practice, policy and guidance, Marm.
Okay, thank you. That was useful summary of the council's broad approach. I think we'll get on to looking at the sites that can't be agreed later on. But I think it would be useful for the HSE, the Mr. Tucker and Mr. Reston, just to set out their position in relation to the plan and their representations.
So we were consulted on a range of allocations some time back last year. We provided representations with regard to those allocations, indicating which sites encroached upon the HSE's public safety zones. And from that point, we were then waiting for a response from the council to determine what criteria they would apply to which allocations they would take forward in relation to whether they would actually look to apply HSE's advice criteria, public safety criteria, or their own, which is basically CS23.
Okay, thank you. And can I just clarify whether the HSE representations were provided as sort of general guidance to the council or general advice to the council, or were they specific objections to specific allocations?
It was general advice. We outlined in our representations what generally we would not advise against and what we would advise against. So, for example, for housing in the inner zone, we definitely indicated we would advise against housing developments brought forward for the inner zone.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the, you sort of clarification in terms of the criteria, if you like, which would be applied to the consideration of development on those sites, was there a discussion on that subsequent to the initial representations?
So HSE's got its own publicised methodology, which the council actually applies and uses to obtain HSE's advice through our web app. So that's readily available. Halton Borough Council have got a lot of experience in obtaining HSE advice in relation to a whole range of different planning applications over several decades now, basically. So they're very familiar in terms of how to obtain HSE's advice. So because there were allocations which indicated basically development types, but not necessarily scale, we can only provide at that point in time general advice.
Okay, I mean, obviously the sites are generally allocated for specific use. And for example, in relation to housing, there is an indicative number of dwellings indicated on those allocations, albeit not with an actual layout or an indication of a sort of a master plan or whatever for the site, but there was a general indication of proposed use and the number of dwellings. Would that have been sort of not sufficient to provide greater advice or clarity?
So we provided reasonable clarity of advice in relation to proposed residential developments in the inner zone, and made that very clear to Halton Borough Council. As you move further away from the hazardous installations into the middle and outer zones, then it depends upon basically the scale and type of development in relation to whether HSE would advise against or not.
Okay, and obviously you heard Mr. Gibbs say that At this stage, obviously, these are site allocations and not planning applications, and that it's potentially too early to rule development out on those sites. What's your view on that, Mr. Tucker, in terms of that approach?
I mean, it's not an entirely unreasonable approach, but ultimately it depends what the council wishes to give precedence to in relation to public safety criteria. Are they going to basically give precedence to HSE's criteria or their own?
I shall put that question back to Mr. Gibbs, who's in the hot seat today.
Thank you, Mel. Essentially, we would give the HSE's advice most careful consideration, but we would also follow the planning law as set out, which is you make your determination in line with the development plan unless material considerations are otherwise. So, as I said earlier, it's difficult to prejudge the development on these sites, and my view is, as I say, I think there's only 4 sites that are between ourselves and HSE, and it would be premature to try and carry out that planning assessment at the allocation stage, because there are merits in favour of the development. Obviously, the pavilions is going through due process anyway, and the other 3, as I say, don't really go to the heart of the plan. So the most pragmatic approach is to let the process as set out in national policy be followed.
Thank you. And Mr. Tucker?
HSE's position with regard to the developments in the inner zone is the fact that at this point in time, one is subject to a call-in by the Secretary of State, because the scale of that particular application is such that we consider the risks to be very significant indeed. And there's another allocation which appears to be of a similar scale. So basically, HSE doesn't want to really be put in the position where we're looking to request call in for a further application. So that surely points to the fact that those current applications would indicate the current plan is not sound.
And just on the sites within the inner zone, it seems to me that there's a sort of a threshold whereby if the site's totally within the inner zone, so fundamentally within the inner zone and at a high scale of development, then that may rule out the site. But there are also, as Mr. Gibbs said, some cases where it may just cross the threshold of just the boundary of the inner zone, and where some development could be accommodated out with the inner zone. And I suppose it's where to draw that line whereby a site is fundamentally not developable due to those restrictions, or where it may be developable, may be compatible development, and that's a sort of a difficult one to judge without a planning application. Don't know what your thoughts on that in terms of where the HSE's threshold, if you like, lies.
Well, the threshold's very low for the inner zone. We're talking about HSE not advising against applications for less than 2 houses in the inner zone. So if you're bringing forward housing in the inner zone which is significantly above that, you're going to automatically attract a HSE advise against.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ruston?
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes, I'd just like to sort of add into another factor, which is our calling criterion, to make that quite clear that, as Mr. Tucker has said, we advise against all housing in the inner zone, apart from very, very small developments, 2 or less for housing. But from there, the scale of the development is very important, and our published calling criteria are applied to developments as a subsequent to if we are get a minded to case, and one of those allocations that is in the plan met that criteria. So our perspective, it's to put into an allocation developments of such high risk provides developers with a false sense of anticipation, as it were. And those criteria are applied nationally across all planning authorities in England, Scotland and Wales.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I wonder whether it's worth first looking at what can be agreed in terms of the sites in the outer zone and sites which maybe touch on the middle zone, and then come back to each of the sites within the inner zone that the council are proposing, and we can talk through those. Just in terms of the list of sites within the council statement, which have been replicated in the HSC statement at page 20 and 21. So just to be clear, from the HSC's point of view, sites within the outer zone are not being objected to. Is that right? The HSC is not raising concern over.
So the Halton Borough Council have assured us that the developments brought forward that they're allocating to the outer zone are such that they can meet HSE's criteria, public safety criteria. So on that basis, that would not be a problem to HSE.
Okay, thank you. And just looking, Mr. Gibbs, you may wish to help me out here, but there are some sites which touch on the middle zone, or sort of where there's small amounts of land within the allocation overlapping with the consultation zone. Do you just want us to take us through that, and we can clarify HSE's position on those?
Yes, ma'am. In the council statement on the health and safety executives reps that we made, I can't remember the inquiry reference, one of my colleagues will be able to give it, but I think it was paragraph 13, I think, they lists the sites there where there's a little development land located in the inner or middle zones. Development layouts can be made to comply with HSE advice. For example, avoiding development in the inner zone or workplaces with less than 100 employees in the inner zone, or less than 30 dwellings in the middle zone there. And then there's, as I say, at paragraph 13, a list of the sites that apply there. I'd also add, ma'am, that in HSE's statement that came in yesterday, at paragraph, I think it's 73, just in the interest of trying to reach common ground, they state there at paragraph 73, it's clear from paragraphs 13 and 14 that the vast majority of allocations that encroach or partially encroach into HSE public safety zones, HSE would in principle not advise against, not object to, providing, as acknowledged by the council, they are appropriately configured when they are brought forward as planning applications. So that's within HSE statements. I think we are on common ground here with regard to these sites, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And can the HSE just confirm that their position in relation to those sites, which potentially overlap slightly, but can be made to conform?
Absolutely. I mean, as the council has stated, that they can ensure that the developments brought forward can be configured such that it meets HSE's criteria, then there isn't a problem.
Okay, thank you. So that's useful to confirm the common ground, hopefully in relation to the site allocations. I think it's worth just talking through the sites identified within the inner zone, where the HSE state they would clearly advise against those allocations. And it would just be useful for Mr. Gibbs to just start with site R83 and just set out the the council's thoughts on that in terms of that balance between the potential benefits weighed against any potential risks.
Yes, ma'am. In regards to R83, as you heard from the session on the Heath allocations, this is related to the Heath Park development proposals, and integral as part of that master plan that Mr. Lewis was bringing forward, and he's well aware of the HSE's position with regard to his site. So there is potential there to vary the risk, and I can give an example of that in that within the Heath Park complex itself, there was a planning application granted for, I think it was around 50 houses that were quite close or closer to the HSE or whatever we call it, the establishment, the hazardous installation, as it were. It was closer to that. So I think Mr. Lewis's intention is to move those houses as part of his master plan away from the location they're currently in, and he's doing that entirely voluntarily. As I say, planning permission was granted for housing that location, but he's taking the opportunity to restructure what's going on there. And we did hear a lot about the merits and benefits with regard to regeneration that site can bring related to employment and housing, and how it's a key employment centre for Runcorn as a whole. So as I say, there are in striking a planning balance factors to be weighed against the negatives.
And just to remind me, Mr. Gibbs, is the site in its entirety within the inner zone, or the parts which are sort of out with the inner zone?
That site's entirely within HSE's inner zone, which is quite an extensive area. If I may, Ma'am, I could just draw your attention to a couple of paragraphs in HSE's own guidance, the land use planning methodology that was again submitted yesterday, and I think came with reference HSE 105_HSE land use planning method, and that's their national statement on the use of the HSE's planning policy. Now, in Annex 3 to that document, at paragraph 6 is the text. Like other statutory consultees, HSE's role in the land use planning system's advisory. It has no power to refuse consent or a planning application. It is the responsibility of the Hazardous Substances Authority or Planning Authority to make the decision, weighing local needs and benefits and other considerations alongside. I'd also add it in the paragraph above the last sentence of paragraph 5, which is the same annex, Annex 3, talks about the HSE's principle of stabilising and not increasing the numbers at risk, with a pragmatic awareness of the limited land availability for development in the UK. So that those two paragraphs of the HSE's own land use planning methodology do strongly state the position that's been given, that their role's advisory, but that there are circumstances where local authority, as a planning authority, can make a decision based on planning merits, and that's what I suggest is the position with R83, that I could foresee those circumstances arising, but obviously I don't want to prejudge, and I can't because we have no application before us where those that balance is struck in that direction. Equally, it may be the case that the council considers it differently and that the development proposed is unacceptable. But as I say, until we're in a position where development is proposed and you have the detail, it's difficult to get to that position. Thank you, Ma'am.
And Mr. Gibbs, you've heard Mr. Tucker say that the limit would be the test would be very low, if you like, within the inner zone, and potentially limited to two dwellings within that zone, which would, if that advice is followed, would severely constrain any development on the site. What's your view on that in terms of, how that site could be brought forward?
As I say, Ma'am, we are entitled as a planning authority to make a decision based on the merits of a development, and to follow proper process which would be for the HSE to advise against and request calling if need be, and that's the case with the pavilion site. But overall, I'd say that I think we are on track and in keeping with the ambition of HSE's policy, which is to stabilise the population across the borough and within these inner zones. And I think I put in part of the council's statement on the HSE reps how the population in the wards that are closest to the ICI complex, the Runcorn complex we've been talking about, which these sites are in the inner zone, is falling and has fallen significantly. And in the past, we've granted planning permission for, I think it was 30 units as part of a persimmon development, where within the Western Village we had properties demolished due to contamination from Western quarries, and it was agreed with HSE that we could replace those units, and that's captured in a planning application. So one consideration might be that precisely that, Ma'am, that we're looking to stabilise the community in this area, but we aren't actually increasing the numbers at risk overall.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Gibson, obviously part of our remit is to consider the developability and deliverability of the sites put forward in the plan. And it seems to me that the potential for call-in application, for example, on this site could, or any of the other sites within the inner zone, could certainly delay progress on those sites. I would have to double check where those sites are within the trajectory. But certainly in terms of that five-year land supply, it would certainly raise questions as to the timing of any development that may come forward on that site, and sort of raise a question mark, if you like, in terms of the developability of those sites and in the longer term, without that certainty that permission could be secured. So just a thought that sprung to mind in terms of our the remit of us to consider the deliverability of the plan.
Yes, Ma'am, and it's a thought that's has occurred to the council team as well, and that I think Mr. Cross can confirm that in terms of our 5-year land supply, we have factored that factor in so that these sites don't form part of that supply to deal with that uncertainty and to give time where necessary.
But obviously it could raise questions in relation to the developability of those sites as well in the longer term, and to be able to meet the tests in the planning practice guidance.
Yeah, all I'd say, Ma'am, is that the call-in is part of the due process that's there. It doesn't preclude the site getting planning permission. It is just another test for the site to go through. But aside from this consultation zone constraints, there aren't any other barriers to development on R83, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Just bring Mr. Tucker in here.
Thank you. So it's my understanding that with regard to R83, as things currently stand with the council's own policies on public safety, it would be pretty much automatically approved.
In relation to the saved policies?
Yes, basically HSE's advice would be set aside.
Okay, and Mr. Tucker, in relation to this particular site, what's your view in terms of whether the site could be developed within the parameters of the HSE advice and guidance?
No, it couldn't. So this is a site which potentially could be subject to call-in to the Secretary of State, because the threshold is we'd not advise against something which is less than sort of 2 houses. So at, I think it's 116 dwellings, that is significantly more than 2 houses.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Riley-Smith.
Thank you, Ma'am. It's just a very brief comment arising out of your reference to the deliverable and developable tests, and of course important to be aware, as you will be, that I think the reference was made to the certainty of that. Of course, the MPPF definition, we're dealing with realistic prospect in relation to deliverable, and we're dealing with reasonable prospect in relation to developable. And of course, just because an application is called in, it's not inconsistent with either of those tests. And of course, I'm grateful to, as Mr. Tucker said, in relation to the application of the council's policy, which will be the test before the inspectorate call in, the site would be approved. And therefore, it's important that we don't delve too much into predetermining what a call-in inquiry might be. But just, of course, to raise that there is nothing inconsistent with a site being called in and it not meeting either the deliverable or developable tests in the MPPF, or I should say definitions rather than tests.
That's a fair point, Mr. Riley-Smith. I was just really using that as an example of potential delays to the site coming forward, but thank you for that reminder. Mr. Tucker.
So this is really an example where the council's own policies basically set aside HSE's advice, and therefore, in that regard, does not give great weight to HSE's advice, which goes against national policy.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker. I mean, that is a difficult one, as that policy isn't before us. So I can't really go into too much detail in terms of the council's policy, I'm afraid. I mean, just in terms of this site, from those discussions, it doesn't appear that there would be potential to secure any common ground on this particular site. Would I be correct in that assumption?
That's correct. There's no common ground with regard to this particular site.
Okay, thank you. Right, moving on. Just to remind you that I won't be able to get into the merits of a particular the planning application or the call-in appeal on this particular site. But Mr. Gibbs, do you just want to sort of set out the council's approach on this site, please?
Yes, ma'am. With regard to the pavilion site, I mean, that site already been to the planning committee, and the committee report documents the
within an inner zone.
It is, ma'am. It's within the same inner zone as the R83, which, as I say, is quite an extensive inner zone that does cover quite a lot of the existing community of Runcorn.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Tucker, clearly the proposed number of units is well above the two unit threshold that the HSE would.
That's correct.
Apply.
Yep. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I really don't want to get into the discussion in terms of the planning application, and I'm guessing there isn't any common ground on this particular.
None whatsoever.
Right. Either, so I think it's probably not worth pursuing discussion on that. In terms of R71, Mr. Gibbs, could you just outline briefly the council's approach on this site?
Yes, ma'am. The final two sites that are listed there are within the inner zone of the SABIC pipeline, which goes through the borough. And essentially, they were sites that came about through the SLAR. But what I would say on these final two sites, ma'am, that within inner zones, they are very small numbers of dwellings. just flicking back to the document, R71's 39 dwellings, which is within a zone of the SABIC pipeline, and the R77, which is 7 dwellings. So again, they're not strategic housing sites, don't really go to the heart of the soundness of the plan. And as I say, I think the most appropriate way is to allow due process to be followed.
Okay, and Mr. Tucker, Mr. Reston, is there any scope for common ground on this particular site?
So with regard to R71, if all 39 dwellings are going to be in the inner zone, that is a significant number of dwellings in relation to that. So it's clearly we would advise against. If it also fell in the middle zone, we would advise against as well, which indicates the level of risk is high. But generally, as a general point, pipeline consultation distances tend to be quite small and limited. So I am surprised that the council has not taken the opportunity of trying to look for the developments slightly beyond the inner zone and possibly middle zones, and look to perhaps develop in the outer and beyond. And the same really says for R77 as well. We're looking at 7 dwellings there. Well, 7 dwellings, if they fell in the middle zone, we wouldn't advise against. So again, it's surprising that the council haven't sought to deal with that particular allocation in a different way.
Mr. Reston?
Yeah, just to add as a sort of a technical add-on to Harvey's statement there about the middle zone of the pipeline. If the density of housings is above 40 per hectare and the numbers are still low, then HSE would advise against for high density development. So 7 dwellings in an apartment situation, for example, we would advise against because of the high density.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So in terms of those 4 sites, I think probably no scope for common ground on those. In relation to MUA 10, similar situation to R83. I'm assuming Mr. Gibbs?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
And the HSE's position is that any development would need to be small in scale to avoid.
Yes, we clearly don't understand what the scale of the proposed development is. So if we're looking at significant numbers of members of the public being present, then we'd clearly advise against that.
Mr. Gibbs, do you just want to just give some clarification in terms of the mixed use policy, which is obviously it's not quite an allocation as we've discussed previously. It's more kind of a development management policy in terms of the type of use which may be considered appropriate on that side. It may just be worth clarifying how that policy would operate for Mr. Tucker, Mr. Reston.
I don't actually have the text before me, ma'am. I don't know whether one of my colleagues might be able to help me out on that one. But essentially, it sets out the types of development that could be suitable for that area. I mean, the Heath Business Park is an existing business park and does currently provide employment for something like 2,500 people already. So it's an existing site. So what we're talking about at the Heath is really a remodelling, regeneration, where it will be unlikely that overall there would be an increase in the numbers at risk. I would say that policy leads to the stabilisation of risk rather than an increase in numbers. And as I say, Mr. Lewis, who's the owner of the site and developing the master plan, is very aware of the HSE's concerns and is factoring that into the proposals to look at reducing risk.
Okay, thank you. So more of a reconfiguration, if you like, of the site rather than sort of an intensification of the use on the site. Would that be correct?
Yes.
I mean, Mr. Tucker, Mr. Weston, given the remit, obviously it's difficult. It's not actually an allocation as such. It's more of a policy to guide the type of uses that could come forward through any reconfiguration of the site. I just wonder whether there's scope there. I mean, I don't know what your views are in terms of the fact that it wouldn't necessarily lead to an intensification of the use or the number of people on that site, and whether there's scope there as such to take a more positive view of that site.
I think our general point is that every time a planning application is brought forward, it provides HSE with the opportunity of presenting its public safety advice, as though the development, there was no previous development. So if it provides an opportunity of reducing the intensity of the use, then that would be reflected in HSE's advice, because as Mr. Gibbs has pointed out, I think he referred to between 2,000 and 2,500 people already work there. So that number of people working in the inner zone of a major hazard installation is not a desirable thing. So if an opportunity presents itself to reduce the density of the population at that location, then HSE will pursue that.
Mr. Gibbs, I guess from what you were saying, it wouldn't necessarily lead to an increase in an intensification of the use, but obviously it is an existing use, which sort of changes things to a degree, but would it necessarily lead to a de-intensification, if that's the right word, of the use on the site?
Yes, Robin, the example that I gave before about the housing application being moved across the site to further away is an example where from the work I've seen that Mr. Lewis and his team are doing, that they are doing all they can to reduce the risk at the site and take that into account in the master plan.
And it seems to me on this particular site there could be scope to take a more positive approach, Mr. Tucker. And I wonder, I'm just sort of thinking out loud, which is always a bit dangerous, but whether there could be scope to include something in the supporting text just to reflect our discussion.
I think we wouldn't want to go that far at all. We stand by our criteria. And every application is judged on its own merits.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we know your position on that. Thank you, Mr. Tucker. So the other site that was questioned is the proposed allocation R6, which do you want to just expand on your query on that, Mr. Tucker? You say the status allocation is not clear. What was your concern about that?
Yeah, my concern was that it appeared in one of the documents, council's documents, which is EL 107, but then is not commented on it in terms of PSD 07. So I don't know whether that allocation still exists or not.
Well, frantically having a look to see if it's still. It doesn't appear to be in the list of sites in RD1, Mr. Gibbs. R5 to R7.
Yeah, I think that's a site in Runcorn Old Town, the old Edgerton Library site. I'm just looking to colleagues for assistance actually at the moment as to where that stands. I'd be grateful if any of them would step in.
I can confirm that R6 is not currently listed in policy RD1, so it is not proposed for allocation at this time. I would have to check back on the previous iteration of the plan to see which site it relates to. I think it might have been backland development close to Runcorn Station, but I would have to double check. But I say it doesn't form part of the current proposals in front of you today, ma'am.
Okay. Does that clarify the situation, Mr. Tucker?
Yeah, considering it's no longer an allocation.
Okay, thank you. And just looking at the statement of common ground, it mentions obviously the safeguarded land designations, and obviously as that land's being safeguarded in the plan is being set aside from the green belt, but it's not actually being allocated. Can I just clarify the HSE's position on the safeguarded sites, please?
So if a site doesn't fall within any of HSE's consultation zones, then we have no interest in offering any advice whatsoever.
Sorry, my signal's breaking up there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, Mr. Tucker, I just missed, I had issues with this morning. I just missed the last part of what you said there.
Okay, so for allocations that don't fall within HSE's public safety consultation zones, then HSE has no involvement in those allocations.
Mr. Gibbs, were there any sites, safeguarded sites, which were subject to, within a HSE consultation zone?
I think, the majority of the safeguarded land sites, there's just small elements of the overall allocation that might be affected by a consultation zone, mainly pipelines, Mum. So a lot of the Runcorn safeguarded sites, SG2, 4, 9, 7, 5, 1, 8, all I think touch on the SR oil pipeline, but as I say, it's a small part of the site, and these are strategic allocations, so we could deal with that downstream at a point where the site was to come forward if needed. But yeah, I don't think there's any significant elements there.
Okay, but there are some areas where there may be overlap with the pipelines. So, Mr. Tucker, given that the sites aren't actually being allocated, they're just being set aside from the green belt, would the HSE?
You're just frozen there, Mom. I think you're back now, perhaps. I think you're back now, Mom. You cut out temporarily again.
I was just about to rejoin, actually. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, we'll persevere. I think, yeah, I'm not sure what point you heard my comments to.
I think you wanted me to respond.
In terms of the position of the safeguarded sites, that would be useful.
Yeah, so providing Halton Borough Council gives a commitment to follow HSE's land use planning methodology criteria, then we would have no objection to that.
Mr. Gibbs?
As I say, Mum, with regard to the Runcorn sites, the majority of them are pipelines, and my view is that we can avoid those zones. That can be taken into account at the point in time when and if a site is brought forward. As I say, it's safeguarded land and not earmarked for development.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the statement of common ground, I mean, usefully, there has been some movement towards an agreed position on a number of the sites. I think what would be useful for myself and Mr. Troy is to if the statement of common ground can be agreed in relation to the sites which there are no objections subject to the development being compatible with the zone it's situated in. But it would also be useful to set out the position on the sites which aren't agreed, as well as the agreed position on site. So in terms of those sites, if the statement of common ground could address the sites which aren't agreed, but also set out the relative position of the council and the HSE, and that just gives greater clarity for us in determining, how we take those sites forward in the plan. And I think that would be useful. I believe there is a bit of an issue in terms of whether or not to include the core strategy policy and PR 12, I think it is, in the statement of common ground. Clearly it's not part of the examination, those policies. I think if they are to be referred to in the statement of common ground, it should just be a very factual reference that they form part of the development plan in relation to this issue. But I think certainly in relation to the sites which were subject to examination, that if we could have a position statement of the sites agreed and the sites which aren't agreed and the reasons why, that would be really, really useful. I'm not sure we can go too much further today on this issue. I'm very happy if parties wish to explore the issue further, if there are any other particular points that wish to be raised whilst we're here. And Mr. Troy, if there's anything that you would like to raise as well, please let me know. But certainly in terms of the sites, having an agreed position would be a useful way forward for ourselves. So, are there any other points, Mr. Tucker, that you wish to raise, or Mr. Gibbs?
No, Ma'am, the council's comfortable with your suggested approach. Quite happy to do that.
I think the other thing, just obviously in the statement of common ground and basically that you produced before, there was just the advice that you follow basically in terms of the inner, middle and outer zones. I think if you could basically include that within the statement of common ground in terms of where there's agreement on the actual approach. So obviously we're clear basically that, obviously that's the agreed approach. Obviously I think it was set out in paragraph 14 of the statement of common ground. So it'd be useful from our perspective if that is the case, that is clearly set out. So it gives us a reference point within the actual document, which are then, I think, you're then using to sort of look at the individual sites. I think basically that seems to be the approach that you're taking. Thank you very much.
Yes, and again, I think if there are points which are agreed in terms of the approach, if they can be set out, and also set out any points which can't be agreed in terms of the approach, are so almost more helpful sometimes than the points that can't be agreed. Mr. Tucker.
So you're happy for clarification's sake in the statement of common ground to at least clarify what criteria is being applied for each site? Yes, is that correct?
It would be more the approach to
the key principles.
The consideration. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, are there any other points? Mr. Riley-Smith.
Thank you, Mara. I promise to be brief. It's just 2 points, one practical, one legal. In relation to the practical point, obviously for whatever reason this is being dealt with in a separate day at the end of the sessions, of course, there has been an allocation session. You very kindly gave the council 7 days to respond to the representations yesterday. And I think that response will be part of the statement of common ground. Of course, it may be that developers or the landowners might have wanted to respond of those relevant sites. I see from the website it has been published, but can I just confirm that if, and it's certainly not my role to be here on behalf of either of them, except for, as it were, for the procedural fairness of the process, that if they wish to put in any representations on what the HSE have put in, they have the time to do so. And I don't know whether it's pragmatic to, as it were, formally make them aware that their sites have been specific discussion today. I just raised that as a procedural point because of the nature of how this session's been involved, but I'm certainly not here on behalf of them. The second point is just a legal point, and again, I think it would be remiss of me not to just briefly raise it. The HSE in their representations quote from the case of Al Fayed, and they append it. I won't go into detail, ma'am and sir, but may I just ask, when you have consideration of that case, if you do, please do go and maybe not read the case in full, but there is a paragraph and 3 opening words that appear immediately before that quote that put it in perhaps better and wider context, effectively as to how a local planning authority should treat a consultation response from HSE. And I think it was just important that it's viewed in its context, that quote, rather than, as it were, just extracted at paragraph 29. I put the point, or I pushed the point no further than that, but I just thought remiss of me not to raise it. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry, what paragraph of the judgment?
The reference in the HSE representations is page 20, is paragraph 29. The copy they've provided is not paragraph numbered. It appears on page 7, and in effect, it appears at the top of page 7. I think the relevant paragraph is at the bottom of page 6, running on to page 7. And the first 3 words of the paragraph they've missed out is "on the other hand." So there's a general proposition in paragraph 6, which is then explained or expanded on in the next paragraph at the top of page 7. It puts the position in wider context.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Tucker, did you want to respond to that, or are there any other?
I see no need to respond to that. In terms of national policy and guidance, it's pretty well spelt out in terms of what the expectation of government is in terms of the application of policy and guidance in relation to sites which have the benefit of hazardous substances.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Riley Smith, in relation to your first point, obviously in the interests of fairness, obviously other parties, particularly the parties whose sites that these issues relate to, would have the opportunity to comment on that, and that's something perhaps Ms. Donnelly can draw the parties' attention to, relating back to their original representations, though.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other points before we close this particular session? Mr. Tucker.
There's a really practical one. I'm going to be on annual leave for the next sort of week and a half. So in terms of assisting the council in preparing and finalising the statement of common ground, then it will be early in July when I'm able to get to that.
Okay, thank you. My connection seems a bit dodgy again. Can anyone hear me?
We still can, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Well, just to say thank you for that, Mr. Tucker. But obviously, if it can be progressed on your return, that would be really useful, or perhaps a colleague could look at that for you. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And just to thank you, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Reston, for coming along today and to contributing to the discussion. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to suggest, obviously, we have the action list to work through with the council, but also closing remarks. Given that my connection's a bit dodgy, I think it might be worth just having a break for 10 minutes, and I'll see if I can reset my Wi-Fi and hopefully help to resolve the connection issue for the closing remarks. It would be a shame to get this far. We've got this far without too many technical issues, so hopefully we can make it to the end. Is that okay with people to come back around 3:20?
Do you want me and Stuart to remain within the meeting?
Only if you really, really wish to. You're welcome to stay, but it's not going to be very exciting, I'm afraid. We're just going through the list of action points, so I would take your chance to escape while you can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Malloy is still having issues. Could we resume at 3:30, please? Thank you. Hello, if everybody's okay, Ms. Malloy is back on. Could we resume at 3:25 if this is agreeable? 3:25 it is. Thank you.
Hello, can everyone see and hear me okay? It's been a bit touch and go. Right, we'll keep going. What I was going to suggest in terms of the list of actions, if my connection does start to go, is it worth Mr. Troy just carrying through the discussion on the list of action points, just so it doesn't slow things down, and I'll try and rejoin when I when I get the opportunity. So yes, here we are at the closing point of the hearing sessions, and what I would like to do before making closing remarks is just firstly to go through the list of action points that's been generated through the hearing sessions, just to see where we're at and to set some deadlines for any of the remaining points, first of all. And then myself, Mr. Troy, will just give a sort of a steer as to the next parts of the process after the close of the hearing sessions, and then we can progress to closing remarks. So is everyone happy with that approach? Are there any other factors or points that the Council would like to discuss as part of the closing session? Okay. So just in terms of the list of actions, thank you to Ms Donnelly and the Council for finalising that list. I think that there are the remaining actions from this morning's meeting, but those could obviously be added in. And obviously a lot of the actions have been done. So thank you for that. I appreciate obviously the Council trying to do the hearing sessions at the same time as following up the action points. So thank you for the ones where progress has been made. No point really in discussing the action points that have been done. Just in terms of matter one there, obviously the Council has set out which points have been fully completed and supplied to us, but also in yellow set out where the action's been done but not supplied to the Council. And those seem to relate mainly to where a proposed modification has been suggested. And I'm assuming it's the Council's intention to provide those proposed modifications all together as a sort of nearly final.
Sorry, ma'am, I was going to say we're happy to take your advice on that. Obviously, the majority of those are, as you say, they're the small policy tweaks. This where individual words have been either added or subtracted, or the updating of the use class order. I say we've got a track changes document that we've been sort of updating as we go. If it's helpful, we can collate those and submit them next week. But they are some of the small matters, so I don't know how many iterations of the proposed mods document that you want to have or want to see.
And obviously, just be mindful of where a modification would be a main modification required to make the plan sound, and an additional modification which is very much sort of minor tweaking. And I suspect there would be some toing and froing potentially on those or the revised wording before we get those modifications right. So it's a process really to go through. But it depends, I think, in terms of potentially the more major changes, how long it would take to get those finalised and to us as to, because obviously we don't want to sit on it too long, I think, in terms of having made good progress up to now. So we'll maybe just take a view on that when we get to the end of the action list, I think, in terms of timescales. So just moving down, matter 3 on the spatial strategy, point M3.1, to consider options for representing the key urban regeneration areas on the key diagram. Are there any timescales for that?
Yes, ma'am, we've already started having a play. It's not a big task, it's just fitting it in with the other tasks. So it'll just be a case of matter of priorities, but we could probably give you a suggested amendment to that next week if need be.
Can I have a date off you for that? Just to pin you down.
Well, as I say, ma'am, it's probably a case of priorities. If we would assist them, I think effectively we were seeing the modifications or the tasks falling into sort of 3 main groups. We've got the small sort of clarifications on the evidence and the small changes to the policy wording, which I say are individually probably quite numerous, but in terms of individually they don't take a lot of time, but I say there's a few of them, so it does sort of add up. We have the more substantive policy changes, and I think that some of those arose over the last couple of days, where we said we'd have a more substantive look at some of the policies, which will take us a little bit longer. And the bit that we do have playing on our mind is we've made a commitment to effectively consult on some additional material. Obviously, the main one being the compendium of open space sites. And obviously, as we're allowing, or we're trying to factor in some consultation on that, we were assuming that those were probably one of the highest priorities to basically get the consultation underway, so that they don't lead to further delay. We did have one query in a group that maybe fits within that, and that's just the final trajectory. Obviously, we had a couple of comments on the trajectory over the last couple of days, so I say we will factor those in, we'll make those corrections. Is it the intention to publish the trajectory for a further final period of consultation, or has it now basically been taken as read?
I think if the developers' comments are taken on board on those sites, there are just a handful really of sites, weren't there? Then that shouldn't need any further consultation on. But obviously, just sort of thinking it through, the tweaking of that trajectory may, for example, affect the 5-year land supply, for example. So it may be worth, and obviously you'll have to amend the 5-year land supply table, an overall trajectory. So just thinking out loud, it may be worth just allowing 7 days comment on that as a sort of a final position, the council's final position on housing land supply, which we'll then take on board. And it may be that you get very few comments on that, but I think, just in the interest of fairness, it may be worth doing that. I mean, that doesn't mean, so of course, that you can't get that to us, whilst it's being, whilst that 7-day consultation period is being enabled, and that would help to inform our consideration of potential mods.
Of course. Sorry, so we came back to, was it 3.1 before I jumped in? I apologise. The key diagram. As I say, it's a minor change. We have already had a quick stab at it on map info, so we're comfortable we could get that to you, or a suggested change to that by the end of next week.
Right, so I'll say the end of next week. So that'll be the 23rd, 5th. I think as a general guide in terms of prioritising, any sort of amendments that are likely to go to the soundness of the plan, I would suggest prioritising those. The sort of more minor or additional potential modifications would be lower down the list because they wouldn't be within the remit of our consideration. Just moving on to the matter 4. Point M4.1's been done. You alluded to the fact, Mr. Cross, that M4.2 has been superseded, really, in the sense that the council's position is now that the 2014 household projections are superseded by the standard methodology.
Yes, ma'am. It was more I think you said we were comparing apples with pears with doing a demographic adjustment to the economic side of the Shelma calculation, and we could see merit in that. So that's why I say we haven't chased the consultants on the demographic adjustment, because we effectively conceded it was a little bit apples and pears. So we were happy to concede that wasn't appropriate.
Okay, that's fine. M4.3's done. M4.4 provide further clarification on the sectoral job growth data for Halton and the health sector, used to support the uplift figures. I've got a question mark on that, casting my mind back to that discussion.
Yes, ma'am. I think that's maybe mixing up 2 points. I think you had asked for to see the difference between the sectoral growth on the Shelma baseline and the Shelma uplift. I think that was the initial basis, which there was a graph in one of our earlier statements that did contain that information, but I think it was a snapshot over the whole period. It's a case of producing a couple of graphs from a spreadsheet, so we can do that. The second point I say was obviously that a number of the parties were making representations regarding the most recent ONS jobs growth figures, and I think that's where the health issue came up. We were saying that we had investigated whether where that growth was located and which sector it was in, because we didn't recognise it. And I say obviously it was about 4,000 to 5,000 growth in the health sector, which our colleagues in our customer intelligence unit did check back with ONS to see whether it was an aberration in the data. Sometimes if something's miscoded to the wrong geographic location, and they effectively said they think it actually was a company that was temporarily located at Daresbury Park, who were effectively, I think, had select doctors, locums, or agency staff. So they were located for a short time at a building in Daresbury Park. So it's effectively, I think it was where they did the payroll. It wasn't 5,000 people working in Halton. It was just where the payroll for an agency was located, and they have actually now relocated out of the borough. So I think that was the issue about health.
Okay, thank you. Right, that's fine. M4.5 has been done, M4.6, and M4.7. M4.8, and add the explanatory note as a footnote to the migration table in Appendix 1 of Matter 4A hearing statement. Was that actually done?
I don't think we have submitted that. I think the question we just had is what format you would want that, and we weren't sure. And I was assuming it's not a full update to the hearing statement. It's just maybe an errata or an addendum sheet. It's effectively, I say, that was one of the ones where I said if you wanted the full table, we're drawn to 9 sides of AO. Because it's the data from ONS is quite extensive, but we can happily do a note. What we'd probably do is, if I say we can do a note, just covering all the action points and listing where it's just sort of a technical note or an update. We can do that and put them all together as appendices where we provide additional information, so such as the graph or the matter for the previous one in terms of the sectoral uplift. We'll do that as in a single paper with an appendices to say that this addresses this point and this is the outstanding issue, so you have it in one place.
That would be useful, thank you. In terms of timescales for that?
Again, we would probably say, I'd probably be safe to say 3 weeks, because I think we want to prioritise getting the stuff that needs to go out for formal consultation first. So I think these are, the latter tasks, so we would probably say maybe about 3 weeks for that.
Okay, that makes sense. And just looking at other housing requirements again, this is an action that's been done but hasn't come through to us and would come through with the revised list of modifications.
Yes, sorry, ma'am. Just one point, just in terms of the mechanics of that. Obviously, we appreciate you need a table of proposed changes, but obviously, just as our working document is a track changes version of the written statement, would a track changes version of the written statement be sufficient as a working document as we go? And then whenever we have the more of the main mods boxed off, then we can actually produce the final table, or produce it in the final table form for you.
My preference, and I'm sure Mr. Troy will speak up if he has a different view, but my preference would be for a sort of a schedule of modifications, really, rather than the revised text. And that the schedule of modifications is what we'd referred to in our report, so that's most useful to us. Obviously, in that schedule of modifications, you can use the sort of strike through for deleted text and bold for new text. So it clearly shows the changes to the policy. But yeah, I think that would be more useful, and I think it's more for the council as to whether you want to publish alongside potentially the revised text, alongside that.
Okie dokes. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think all of the points under the other housing requirements are suggested changes, which appear to have been done, and those would come through with the revised modifications, list of modifications. Are there any other points on those particular other housing requirements? Just really alterations to the policy, isn't it? To the policy wording. Matter 6, matter 7, no actions arising. In terms of matter 8 and the green belt, the first point's been done as part of PSD 16. As have the other matters. In the matter M8.5, supply a detailed mapping of development proposals in Warrington close to Hull. And PSD 23, can you still hear me?
You broke up for a second there, but yes, matter M8.4 and .5, PSD 023R, yes.
Okay, thank you. Matter M8.7, policy GB2, we consider the policy wording that's still being worked on, I believe.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Matter 9, again, just changes to policy wording, mainly, which will come through. Matter point 9.4, show the additional work with regards to the junction improvements. Where's that at in terms of progress on that action point?
If Miss Brindley can remember the latest update, I say obviously our highways colleagues have been chasing up. We were noting, however, that the Highways England did turn up to St Helens examination and were entirely happy with Junction 7, so we're a little bit bemused, and we'll be taking that up with them.
Okay.
But we'll get you an update on that from our Highways colleagues to see if we finally reached final resolution on that point.
Okay, thank you. Any other points on matter 9 there, Mr. Troy, which have
No, I think the mainly policy changes. Obviously, just an update on that that junction work that we spoke about. Obviously, end of the transport matters and the statement of common ground. So, yeah, if we can work on that, that'd be very helpful.
Thank you. And matter 9, infrastructure. Again, those points are done, but need to come through in terms of modifications. Any other points on that, Mr. Troy?
No.
Matter 10, a natural historic environment. Can the council just update us on point M10.1 in terms of the policy H1 and the inconsistency between the policy and the proposals, map?
Yes, ma'am. I say there was a couple of issues here. I say there's issue in terms of the disconnect between the terminology and the plan and on the policies map. So that has been addressed. That's just a quick change to the map layer. The more substantive issue was the redefining the core biodiversity areas and incorporating those onto the policies map. Obviously, that data is data that's generated by the Merseyside Environmental Advisory Service on our behalf. We have had talks with them after the sessions to make sure that we have the most up-to-date mapping, so they have provided us with the most up-to-date mapping. We are just needing to just do the sense check. If you remember, I think it was Emery Planning were very dismissive of the data in terms of it being, as they kept referring, saying broad brush. And so we have agreed with our colleagues at MEAS that we will recommend some changes where there is obviously an inconsistency between the broad brush data, which I hasten to add, the data source that does seem to be the problematic one is the one data source that they're instructed to use from Natural England. The other data sources seem to be finer grained. But we agreed that we would basically make recommendations to MEAS as to areas that we would exclude because patently they were not as assessed. I think the example that was used was the playing fields at Murdershaw roundabout, which was shown as deciduous woodland. So we were going to basically do that exercise, go back to them and confirm that they are happy that the changes do reflect the situation on the ground, and then we will basically confirm the new boundaries for the CBA to be incorporated onto the policies map.
Okay, thank you. That sounds like a longer term task to finalise in terms of a date. Is it worth putting a date into work to? to focus on?
That's probably the 3 to 5 weeks. We'll aim for 3, but if we say 5, then I say it's because obviously we are sort of getting into holiday season and we are slightly dependent upon third parties.
Okay, thank you. That's connected to 10.3 in terms of supporting evidence for the core biodiversity areas to be added to the examination library. Is that a fairly quick win?
I think so. I mean, obviously the main data is hosted by MEAS. They have an interactive map, so yes, it would probably be a document that would just have a link to the existing online resource. It wouldn't be practical or practicable for us to basically host that information on our site, so we're happy to provide a link to where it can be found.
Just to be clear on that, obviously, as far as the discussion that took place, obviously the natural improvement focus areas, from my understanding, there are specific documents for basically the Holton and the Holton Borough that are specific to Holton. And I got the impression, obviously, from the discussion that there were freestanding documents that could effectively be, put onto the examination website. That was just my take on basically some of the discussion. So it's just worth. I appreciate that they're mainly hosted on the MUA's website, but the difficulty we've got, they're not within the examination library. So even though there were some references to those improvement areas, it would be useful if, a bit like the conservation appraisals that we ask you to look at, it's just useful if that information is hosted or brought into the examination library, so we can obviously refer to if we need to in terms of our reports. So it's just that particular point, because I think some of them may be freestanding documents. So
we'll double check and see. I mean, I know that they say the core biodiversity area it's an interactive online resource where you open it up and basically you can zoom in and query, switching on and off the different layers. As I said, what we were proposing to do is that we'll put a document in the library that has a hyperlink linking directly to the online resource from MEAS. I say I'm not sure the mechanics of us actually importing their entire online resource onto our website. I think that wouldn't be practicable.
No, I wasn't into. I appreciate there's an online interactive map, and I didn't really ask you to do. Obviously, that really wasn't the discussion. I think it was really there were some supporting documents that provided the basis on which they develop the actual areas within Holton, and it's those supporting documents that provided the basis on which they define the individual areas within the basically the core biodiversity areas. I just wanted those supporting documents, if they could be just put in, not the interactive map. I appreciate that.
Yes.
That's a freestanding issue, and I appreciate the link probably would be sufficient.
Yes, sir. I say if my colleague Miss Moyers was on, then she would probably know them off the top of her head. It's more her particular area of expertise, but we'll investigate the documents and we'll make sure that they are uploaded as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. I think the other points under that matter are modifications to the text, so they'll come through in due course. Matter 11, implementation whole plan viability, and point 11.1 to expand on how the assumption of 2,500 per unit section 106 cost has been arrived at. Can I just ask on progress with that? If you can hear me, because strange things are happening on the screen again.
Mr. Troy seems to have frozen on my screen. I could hear him, but he had frozen, but I can hear you, and you are still animated. Yes, effectively, I believe the question that was asked at the session was effectively in relation to the Section 106 monies that had been generated over recent years. obviously, as all councils, we are now required to publish details of our Section 106s, I think every December. Mr. Plant's got a pained expression on his face, so yes, it definitely was last December. So effectively, we've got that information. What we haven't yet managed to complete is we are going to marry the data from individual applications to housing sites and to the unit numbers, and so then to generate the cost per unit. And that's to say, it's just a sort of an arithmetic, quick sort of Excel query. So we don't see it as being problematic. It's just fitting it in. So we'll get that to you. So that's probably again in the 3 to 5. I say unless it's a particular priority, and then say we can bump it up.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify whether Mr. Troy can still hear us, or have you lost your connection?
No.
You're still here?
Yes, I'm still here. If you can still hear me,
we can't see you, but we can still
that's
hear.
That's fine. Yeah, I'll try putting. Yeah, it's obviously technical issues, aren't we? It's late in the day.
I shall keep going. Determined to get through. So in terms of general actions, open space studies now been submitted, as has the revised trajectory. Yeah, M12.1, HPC to confirm timing and delivery of highway junction works to strategic residential allocations SRL1 and 2. Can the council just confirm where that's at, please?
I'm not aware. Let's see, but we'll chase that up with the highways colleagues. I don't think it shouldn't be problematic. I think it's areas that the council has been bidding for monies, and there are works in the schedule. But we'll get clarification on that for you from highways.
Thank you. HPC to modify policy RD1 to show 300 dwellings for strategic residential allocation SRL1. Presume that would just be as part of the modifications.
Yes, ma'am. It would be that, and then obviously the trajectory. But yes.
And the next point, 17, to prepare housing trajectory for site R32 based on the hearing discussions. Presumably that's been done through PSD 16. Has that been overtaken by?
I think so, ma'am. I think I've just left it on there to make me double check to make sure that it had incorporated. So we're just going to have to track back and see what was specifically said about that site. But we think it has been incorporated already. But it's just a quick double check.
Thank you. Those discussions seem a very long time ago now, don't they? 17, to prepare housing trajectory on site R32. Again, that should be picked up in PSD 16. I just wish to double check that for your own there.
Yeah.
The next 2 points, 18 and 19, have been covered. Point 20, to provide maps to show differences in the open space designations before and after taking into account the open space study findings. And there's 3 question marks.
Yes, I was hoping you could assist with what the heck that's relating to. I'm struggling to understand what the requirement was.
Yeah, the latest work you've done effectively delivers that in terms of the PSD 22A, and obviously the mapping. It essentially differentiates the different types of open space designation. So I think effectively that work is done by PSD 22A and BC. So I think that's can be signed off.
Thank you, sir.
The next point, 21, I think again has probably been overtaken by PSD 16.
Yes, ma'am.
And the same for point 22.
Yes, ma'am.
Matter 12A. Those points have all been addressed. Yeah. Just looking at point 12.20 or number 42, R45, check whether the planning permission's extant, as in whether groundworks have been carried out. Is that something that's been checked yet?
I haven't checked with our monitoring colleague yet. Mr. Plant probably actually might have checked in the meantime. It's the hotel at the bottom of Castle View, Castle Rise. What's the name of the hotel? I'm trying to remember. Halton Village. You can picture it. We will double check that. I say it's one of the. It was on the list to double check in terms of Ponderosa. The programme officer comes to the rescue. The Ponderosa. I say we'll double check the status of that. It was part of the sort of the roundup of all the housing issues and for incorporation into the trajectory.
Okay, and the next 2 points, 43 and 44, would have been overtaken by PSD 16. Unless there were other concerns. And the point 45 in relation to R49 to check situation with the Frodsham, how do you say that line?
Frodsham.
Frodsham line. Yeah, what has that been followed through?
I think that's another one I'm not entirely clear unless my colleagues are what the issue was. We'll probably have to track back and see our records. R49 is located close to the railway tunnel, but not on top of the railway tunnel, so I'm not quite sure what the issue of the Frodsham line. I'm assuming it's meaning it's either meaning the railway line, or it could be meaning in relation to the pipeline, which probably means it was part of potentially getting dragged into this afternoon's deliberations, but it seems that HSE, with confirming that there's only 4 sites that they have particular issue with, it seems like that one's not now got pulled in. Mr. Plant's looking confused. I'm assuming it's the pipeline rather than the railway line.
Yeah, I would agree.
Somebody shorthand and taking notes.
Railway.
Okay, thank you. Oh.
So I think in terms of that, we would probably say that we have provided the mapping for all the sites that came close or that intersected with any of the PADI consultation zones. So we will have provided mapping for that site. Obviously, HSE have been here today and they didn't raise particular issues regarding R49, so hopefully that will get washed up in the Statement of Common Ground. So I think that action has been done.
Brian, thank you. And point 47's been actioned. Matter 12B, the allocations in Widnes, the points I think have been actioned. Yeah, they're all ticked off. Mr. Troy, was there anything in terms of 12B you wanted to raise in the action points?
No, I think again the obviously the one at the very bottom is the 1237, and the council obviously providing now an update on the open space study, and obviously playing picture that's done as well. So no other points to add at this stage.
And moving on to the next matter in relation to SRL9, SG11, SG13. Yeah, M12.39, the council are going to make amendments to the boundary of site SG11 to take account of the existing woodland and greenbelt along the boundaries. I mean, obviously that's more of a matter for the policies map.
Yes, ma'am. I think we did actually provide a map of that in one of our statements, but obviously we'll incorporate it into the proposed mods document for the mapping. It does obviously amend the site boundary, so that's why it's down as a policy issue as well. We'll amend the site boundary on the policy as well. So it's you have had sight of the change, but I say we haven't submitted it formally.
In terms of the other residential sites in Widnes and Hale, there's just the action point M12.42 to delete site W43 and shows a main modification. So that again would there would be reference to it in the main mods, but then the associated changes to the policies map.
Yes, of course, ma'am.
Right. Just looking at the matter 13A and B. M13.5, the HPC to provide a table showing the latest position of the delivery of each of the sites as discussed through the hearing session, the overall total supply of employment land in the borough. Could you just update us on where you're at with that, please?
We haven't actioned that as yet, but our monitoring colleague, he has completed the housing monitoring, so I'm assuming he probably has completed all the employment monitoring. We know that he has input all the information on the latest application, so it's just, we assume he's done site visits. So we don't see that being problematic. We should try and get that to you. I see if he's got time, we'll try and get him to do that for you next week. And similarly, there was the similar request for retail when we get to it in terms of retail proposals. So we'll mop those up at the same time.
Okay, thank you. And just moving on to town centre and retail, the council is going to confirm the latest position on the bus station. Have there been any further discussions on that?
We have had some pretty pictures from our colleagues in Regen. Who'd have thought that Regen have some pretty pictures? They're actually really quite nice, some of them. We can submit those. It was, as is the way of things, it was on a stupid square format, so I couldn't easily cut and paste it in as an appendix to one of the previous papers. So that's the only reason that you didn't get it earlier. But I'd say this proposals for the redevelopment or the extension of the Brindley. I think you talked about the Mound site, as we referred to it, south of the Brindley, the theatre linking down to the bus station, and some draft proposals for the bus station. So we'll get those submitted.
I mean, obviously there may be some draft plans floating around from your Regen colleagues, but I think what we'd be looking for as well is a view as to how that might impact on the allocation and whether it would affect the allocation as it stands or whether it would need amending. so that it's not just a case of sending the plans through. So maybe it's just I don't know, half a page in terms of what impact that would have on the allocation, if at all. Can I ask for a date for that, please? End of next week.
I think one of my colleagues is sending me a message saying Ken's off. That's probably, would say 3 weeks, and definitely within 3 weeks. That's probably that safest.
Mrs. Brindley's obviously keeping you right there. Next, point 62, to provide an update in terms of retail development. Obviously, we've discussed that, and that would be within similar timescales. Into the employment information. Gypsy and travel allocations. I don't think Mr. Gibbs is here, but there's going to be an update in terms of the recent flood modelling of the Ship Canal. And discussions with the EA to resolve the outstanding objection, hopefully on that site, and with a view to providing a statement of common ground. Has there been any progress on that?
We'll have to chase them on that. I think, I say the latest modelling, I say you have had sight of the flood map. It has actually it has reduced the area that's projected to be at higher risk of flooding. Although it hasn't completely removed it. So I think Mr. Gibbs' initial thoughts were that there was still sufficient developable land in order to meet the number of units or number of pitches that we would be looking to accommodate on there. But I'm not sure whether he has actually progressed or had the opportunity to progress talks with EA. So we will chase him on that.
Thank you. It would be useful to have a revised position on that, given the updated modelling. And the next, point 60, summary of the net capacity of each of the Gypsy and Traveller sites and the degree to which they meet the requirements set out in the Gypsy and Traveller study in terms of 5-year supply and the overall plan period. I mean, the point on that really was that it became apparent during the discussions that some of the allocations are existing sites, and it's really to what degree there is capacity on those sites, free capacity to meet any additional requirement as set out in the Gypsy and Traveller study, just to get an overall picture of sort of any vacancies on those plots which could meet that requirement. So that's quite important, really, to be able to form a view as to whether the 5-year supply can be met. So I'd say that was a more urgent action to be prioritised. And is it possible to do that by the end of next week?
We can. I will say we can do our best. I say we'll try and get it for you by the end of next week. I say that I'll chase Mr. Gibbs to see where he's up to. But in terms of, I say, quantifying the numbers of pitches on sites, then that should be quite straightforward.
Okay. It's not just the existing number of pitches on site, but any spare capacity within those sites to meet the requirement. In terms of just moving on, the safeguarded land, first couple of points being actioned. In fact, all of those points have been actioned. Just in terms of point 29, council and developer to agree the start date and annual output of SG4. That's been overtaken by PSD 16. It's just not marked as.
I assume so, yes, ma'am.
I think the output of safeguarded sites was included in there, wasn't it?
Where there was discussion, yes, ma'am, we put in the details.
In terms of matter 17, housing, land supply and delivery, obviously those are newer action points, and you wouldn't have had a chance to look at those. I mean, what I would say in terms of priorities is that those points are very important. It's important for us to have an up-to-date and the sort of council's final position, if you like, in terms of housing, land supply. So I think those should be at the sort of top of the list of your priorities, or one of the top priorities, if possible.
Yes, we'd already jotted that down.
Looking at the number of action points, I don't know where the end of next week might be a bit ambitious, but I'm happy to take views on that.
For the most part, it's just checking numbers on a spreadsheet. It mostly looks up to itself. So by inputting the data into one tab, it generates the trajectory update and the figures. So it's just going through and with the copious notes that we had, just making sure that we had tried to capture everything. Obviously, I say with this week's sessions, I say we missed a couple of points, or we're just slightly out on a couple of points, but I say we'll address those and get it sorted, and then you say subject to get a consultation on the website.
Thank you. Matter 18, the employment development policies. There were some action points, I think, which my colleague sent through in terms of modification of the policies. Is that right?
They're fairly minor, so they'll come through. We've sent them through to limit basically. There were just minor changes, and obviously reflecting changes to these classes. So, I think they were mainly to RD1, I think, so from the discussion today. So I think they'll just need to be just updated in the actual action list, so that along with obviously the other ones that have been sent through from today.
Yes, sir. Lynn's appended the actions for the latest sessions at the bottom of the document. So you see matter 18, there was the two actions identified. So we'll get those updated.
Thank you. In terms of the residential policies, matter 19, the first few points obviously relate to the open space studies we've discussed. And in terms of the performers for each open space site, I'm guessing that's going to take a little bit longer to do.
Yes, ma'am. We have got it's a database from the original consultants. I think my colleague in our IT section did roll his eyes when he sort of saw it. I think he said he had a painful 2 weeks trying to decipher it. It's not as complicated as it looks. So we're just in the process of rejigging the data into a form that we can then import or relink back to the mapping software, and then we can basically use that to produce pro formas. So there is a little bit of work, but I say it should be achievable within about 3 weeks. As I say, this is probably, I've noted down as sort of after the trajectory and the housing numbers is sort of the second priority, because I say obviously the need for the additional consultation.
Okay, thank you. And obviously there's some further down some changes to policy wording. But it's obviously a relatively fresh action point, so they need to have time to look at those. Do you have a view in terms of timescales for the rest of those action points in terms of reviewing the policy wording? Would those come through with the revised set of modifications?
As I say, ma'am, for the more straightforward tweaking the odd word here or there, we can action those quite quickly. With regards to where we're looking at a bit more fundamental look at the policies and where it's particularly the interrelationship between multiple policies, I say that is probably we're seeing sort of about 5 weeks is probably the date when it would be safe. So I see Mr. Plant, I think, was saying by the end of July we'd definitely have that with you, but hopefully before. But just with holidays and being able to have everyone available to have the suitable conversations in conflab and to proof and double check, probably 5 weeks would be what we'd be saying.
Okay, thank you. Don't think there are any changes on connectivity policies, Mr. Troy.
Again, I've fed those through to Lynn Donnelly today. So basically, again, they will be fed into the table. So yeah, again, there's just changes that obviously suggested. Some of them suggested by the council that we've discussed. That in response to our matters, issues and questions. So again, they'll be wrapped up in the modifications, predominantly the fairly sort of minor in general.
Okay, thank you. And I think in terms of matter 21, Halton Centres, matter 22, the design sustainable development policies, that's all sort of just changes to the policy wording, which will be picked up.
The only thing I might say on matter 22, just the action points I've got in front of me, I think probably just need to be slightly updated. Just to I just had a quick glance through the document that was just sent through to us by Lynn. So just to make sure they sort of reflect the latest list that we sent through that Lynn would receive this morning. And again, it's really the same point in relation to the environment, really. If they could you could just make sure, again, they're largely changes to that we've discussed, but it's just if they could just make sure they marry. There just seems to be a few issues of mismatching, or just in terms of the actual wording. But it just, if that could just be dealt with. I mean, the one I point out in terms of for matter 23, the first one under HD 9, which is M23.1, I think it says add including in terms of HD1B, it says add including minor developments and changes for clarity. I think that was the addition you're intending to do, and I was basically indicating that I had some concerns with that in relation to consistency with policy. So if you just in terms of national policy, in terms of the NPPF, so it's really just to make sure that was looked at and whether that was appropriate to be included within that particular part of the policy. So if you could just, obviously make sure you look at what the latest in terms of the list is, just to be absolutely sure.
Mr. Troy, were there any other points on matter 23? Just looking down the list, obviously suggested changes, but were there any other inconsistencies just from checking your notes?
No, again, I guess in terms of priority, in terms of rewording, obviously there was I think under M2314, it talks about reworking of obviously the CS21, R21H. It was basically HE4 and HE6. That's obviously quite a significant change in terms of potentially for those, really, if those could be brought forward so we can see those fairly early. I appreciate that. That would obviously help in terms of our deliberation, and just obviously give you a chance to sort of feed those. We can feed any comments back to you on those. So it's really the main areas of work I think we've already talked about in terms of the open space pro formas, but in terms of obviously modifications, that one was probably one of the ones that really, I think, probably because there was quite a lot of probably reworking in that area given the debate. I think that would be helpful if that was submitted to us as soon as possible. So I don't know whether Mr. Grosh, you've got an idea in terms of the time frames, particularly for those where there are sort of more significant reworking, how they might pan in terms of your work.
As I say, it's just we're getting into a little bit into holiday season, so I think we're sitting on the ground next week, hence the fact I've been saying potentially 3 weeks. So we will put this as a priority to try and look at whenever the team's available say the week after next, and they say, well, if we make substantive progress, then we can fire through what we've got. So we'll try to get it to you as soon as possible. But as I say, I've noted down that that's sort of, number priority 3 to make progress in terms of putting through suggested changes.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Trow, are there any issues under matter 24?
Again, it's just minor. It's modifications to the wording again that I think largely we discussed and agreed. So just obviously just reflect the latest matters that I've sent through to Lynn Donnelly. So that'll be fine. Obviously, matter 25 there wasn't any issues, and matter 26 obviously. The main issue there is obviously just there's got to be some re-looking obviously at the local plan monitoring framework in Appendix G. So I think we obviously discussed that earlier. So again, I appreciate that may take a bit of time just to look at, but in terms of looking at that particular issue, but yeah, those points have been put through again to Lynn as well.
Okay, thank you. And obviously the final point is that the Council has 7 days to respond to the HSE information in the interests of fairness. So I think that takes us through the list of action points. What I was going to ask, could the Council or Mrs. Donnelly update that list with the revised timescales in? On the basis of our discussions, and then send it through to ourselves via Lynn. That would be really useful. Just in terms of the next stages, the sort of normal process really would be for ourselves to write to the Council to confirm whether or not the Council has met the duty to cooperate. And in that letter sort of set out that we'll work with the Council on the proposed modifications. So that will be the first action point. In terms of the modifications, I think to a degree we're in the Council's hands in terms of timescales. Appreciating what you're saying about sort of people being on holiday, which is something I was going to raise. I mean, our initial thoughts really in terms of the suggested modifications, if we can have a suggested schedule of modifications updated to reflect the discussions in the hearing and the action points. Depending when we get that, we thought we could potentially get a letter to yourselves with a list of modifications, which would, in some ways, just link back to the Council suggested modifications if we're happy with those, or we would include revisions or new modifications we consider needed to make the plan sound. And ideally, it would be good to get that done before the sort of summer holidays. Just to note that Mr. Troy and myself are on leave over quite a significant part of the summer holidays. So just to flag that up, and I think that will, depending when you can get the information to us, will depend on whether we can get the suggested modifications out before we go on leave. So just to note that really, but obviously we'll do our utmost to keep things moving. I think after maybe it's a bit of a slow start, there has been really good progress made in terms of the hearing sessions, and I think it would be good to keep up that momentum if we can do. And if that is possible for us to get to agree modifications to go out to consultation. We were thinking potential consultation in the autumn on the modifications. I think it would probably be unrealistic to consult modifications before then, given leave commitments and on both sides of the the equations. So that's really our thoughts in terms of the timescales. But as I say, it's dependent really on when we get information back from the council. But I'm sure the council, like ourselves, would be keen to keep up the momentum that we've gained on the plan.
Yes, ma'am. In fact, my next job is to get potential modifications on the forward plan, which obviously they have to be on. Should be on the list 3 months in advance. Which will just be a nice one for Mr. Plant to explain whenever we speak to a brand new portfolio holder. He'll want to know what it means.
I mean that would.
Yeah, can I ask what the process is you need to go through, just in terms of the timeframes for your approval of modifications? Just if that's obviously in terms of the likely timeframes as well that you anticipate as well, that would be just useful. I know each local authority has different processes for approving modifications. So.
Yes, say we've had completely new wards at the last election, so it was an all-out election. Usually we're elections by thirds. We do have a new leader and we do have a new portfolio holder. We are lucky in that the leader in particular has basically been closely involved with planning or kept up to speed with planning, so he's very familiar with the process and he knows the plan. He's been involved with it as it's been going through. The previous leader had indicated that we could sort of shortcut some of the approvals processes and pretty much go straight to full council for approval for consultation on mods. I don't think the conversations maybe been had with the new leader, but I would be surprised if he wouldn't be equally amenable to fast track any of the modifications approval for the consultation on the mods through to full council. I say the plan has received broad support, I think, in the past from councillors, so we don't envisage there being any problems. And also we'll be on the phone shortly to our sustainability consultants to get them lined up to make sure that the necessary SA and assessments are undertaken so that the plan can be progressed and consulted on.
Okay, thank you. So do those sort of timescales sound feasible that we've discussed, bearing in mind the sign-off process?
Yes, ma'am. I say that was what we were envisaging. I think it's pretty much what we've put in the draft LDS. I say we're hopeful. I think we were saying we were hopeful to be out to consultation, I say, in the autumn, 6 weeks, which is then, I say, depending on when, taking us probably into sort of late November, December time, and then obviously you have the intervening period to make your final considerations and issue hopefully a positive report in the new year.
Okay, thank you. Right, what was the other thing I was going to raise? I mean, obviously there will be some toing and froing, I think, in terms of the suggested modifications. So I think it's just hopefully if all parties can get back, sort of fairly promptly to help things along, that'd be really good. Thank you. Mr. Troy, just before we look at closing remarks, was there anything else that I might have missed in terms of other matters?
No, I think that covers everything we need to discuss at this stage. So yes, no other matters to raise.
Are there any other matters the council would like to raise?
No, I think we've got a clear list of priorities and actions, so we will. We know what to focus on first and to put resources there, and hopefully, I say, we'll get the material to you as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Myself, Mr. Troy, just wanted to make some closing comments. and to thank the council's policy team and other colleagues which have supported the examination for their contributions to the hearing sessions. I mean, as I said at the close of part 2 hearings, myself and Mr. Troy have prepared plans in local councils, and we are fully aware of the amount of work that goes into even getting a plan to submission stage, let alone the amount of work that goes into supporting the hearing sessions. So, they can be pretty intense. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the council's team for all of the hard work that has been put into getting the plan this far in the process. And secondly, I'd like to thank Ms. Donnelly for all the support in the run-up to and during the hearing sessions, which I think have run pretty much like clockwork, which is down to Lynn's professionalism and willingness to help and go above and beyond, which includes checking out email accounts when she's on leave. So I hope Lynn's still here. But I just want to say thank you very much, Lynn, for your support throughout the hearing sessions. And I think also to say thank you to the council's IT team for hosting the virtual sessions, which have all run very smoothly. Certainly our first local plan, sort of hearing held virtually, and I think it's been a positive experience and only a couple of technical hitches, thankfully. So yeah, and I'd also like to thank all of the participants who've contributed to the discussions in a positive and and constructive way. And we've had some sort of interesting discussions and debates. And I also like to echo the sentiment really at the beginning of the hearing sessions. It's a shame that we weren't able to be in Halton in person for the hearing sessions, but myself and Mr. Troy have enjoyed our site visits. We've been a couple of times now, so we have a good appreciation of the character of the borough, and I'm still waiting for that ticket for driving down a bus lane. It hasn't materialised yet, so I'm hoping there weren't any cameras en route. So yes, thank you all very much. And I don't know how the council felt the virtual hearing sessions have gone in comparison to physical hearing sessions. How's the council felt it's gone in terms of the virtual format?
I think it has actually. It's obviously been linked with the fact that we all had to start working from home, and we had to adjust. It has been a bit of a steep learning curve, but I think it has gone broadly smoothly. Obviously, whilst we do have the inquiry session on Teams, we also have the Skype messaging service, hence the occasional pings and the sort of, oh, somebody's just messaging me. So it's the virtual version of passing notes. Unfortunately, I think Piers has been suffering from not being on the Skype system, so we've been also running WhatsApp group in the background as well. So if the head's docked down and you look like I'm looking at the phone, it's basically checking up on the discussion on WhatsApp.
Brilliant. And I'm just totally amazed the kids haven't popped up in the background at some point, because they're absolutely desperate to be on YouTube. I think I went up in their estimation when they realised I was on YouTube. It's like, Mum, you've had 61 likes. No, it's not me. So I managed to get away with that anyway. So yes, so just thank you all very much. And let's keep the momentum going and sort of move the plan forward.
And I would just say, before we finish, I would say obviously the council, we echo the thanks to Lynn and the IT team for the support. Has been invaluable. So I would just like to say thank you. Thank you, Lynn.
Is Lynn still there?
She's glowing red in the bottom corner of my screen.
I can't see. Okay, Mr. Troy, you're still here. Well, you deserve a long weekend off, Lynn. Shame you didn't manage to get to Tenerife, but enjoy a few days off.
Thank you.
Mr. Troy, is there anything else?
No, not at this stage. But yeah, thanks to everybody for all the great effort that made from all parties basis. So just to echo sort of Miss Malloy's comments there. So thanks for everything. Obviously, thanks for Lynn particularly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, well done, everyone. I think everyone deserves to go and have a stiff drink now for managing to get through what's it, 5 weeks of hearing sessions. They're brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know about a stiff drink, but I'm off for my COVID jab.
Not quite the same.
No. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.